ago, Professor Hattery needed to go out of town for a conference. And so she was like, well, I know you're coming anyway, would you mind introducing our keynote? I was like, absolutely fine, I'm there. So I'm going to give you the technical bio of our keynote, Talitha LeFlouria, Dr. LeFlouria, and then I'm going to share a little bit more. So, Dr. Talitha LeFlouria is the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor in African and African American Studies at UVA, so right down the road from us. She is a scholar of African American history, race and medicine, mass incarceration, black women in America. And she is the author of an absolutely wonderful book. I've used it in several courses, Chained in Silence, Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South. And it would be impossible for me to overemphasize the significance of her book. The book has received countless awards, well over 6 or 7 awards for her scholarship, for her engaged perspective, and really elevating our conversation around black women and the carceral state. So if you've had a chance to see the documentary Slavery by Another Name, it's a wonderful documentary. Her work is featured in that documentary. She's also been profiled in countless other magazines and newspapers like The Nation and the HuffPost and the Harriet. And she is on several boards that explore slavery and black women's history, and really does a lot of work with other black women historians to make sure she centers the work and their scholarship. But I think the reason why I'm absolutely tickled pink and so excited is that we discovered recently that we have a really amazing connection. And that is both of us are HU grads, the real HU, Howard University. We both finished at our doctoral degrees in the history department. We share faculty members. We just spent the last 30 minutes sharing, oh my gosh, you took Medford, oh, you had this person, you had Carrington. Amazing. And our journey at Howard and what it meant to be at an HBCU, what it meant to navigate those spaces as black women, and now to find ourselves at UVA and Mesa and to be able to share with each other and commune. We decided that we are going out to have drinks and dinner afterwards because we need to continue this dialogue. So you are absolutely in for a treat to have an opportunity to be in this space and to hear about her scholarship and the amazing contribution that she's making to the field. So without further ado, Professor LeFlouria.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Wendy, for that very generous introduction. I'd also like to thank Angela Hattery, who can't be with us today, for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference. I'm very honored to be here and to serve as your keynote speaker. Over the summer, the city of Sugar Land, Texas made national headlines when the bodies of 95 black prisoners were found buried in a historic cemetery on property. They're setting up the PowerPoint, so I'll show you the image in just a moment. When the bodies of 95 black prisoners were found buried in a historic cemetery on property owned by the Fort Bend Independent School District. These individuals worked in the state's convict lease system from 1878 to 1911. Of the 95 bodies found, 94 were male and 1 female. As the city of Sugar Land maneuvers to bury its shame in this moment, by relocating the skeletal remains to a nearby cemetery to make room for a construction project that is now set to continue on the empty graves, which I'll show you in a moment. I am caught up in imagining what life must have been like for the only female prisoner found in Sugar Land. The desecration of this burial site is deepening my interest in knowing more about this woman. But because the details of her existence are unknown, I must rely on the archive of my imagination to make meaning of her life. My curiosity demands to know the answers to these questions. Where was she born? What was her name? Had she been a slave, a wife, a mother? Where had she worked? Why was she arrested? How did she arrive at Sugar Land? And what bitter realities had she faced there? What were her assigned duties in the prison camp? Did she cook, clean, cut lumber? Did she sew crops or sew clothes? How did she feel being shipwrecked in a sea of men? What did she witness? How did she suffer? Was she raped? Did she give birth? Did she get enough to eat? How did she die? We may never know the answers to these questions, but I do know that the only woman at Sugar Land was not alone. At the same time that she was confined in Texas, thousands of black women were held captive in convict lease and chain gangs throughout the South. They were everywhere yet nowhere, hidden in mobile railroad camps, brickyards, lumber mills, mines, plantations, stockades, kitchens, wash houses, barns, big houses, chain gangs, infirmaries, and unmarked graves. From sunup to sundown, they worked under the sting of the lash, grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, digging ditches, smelting iron, building roads, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine, plowing fields, hoeing weeds, washing clothes, cooking food, and picking crops. In the course of their dizzying work routines, women prisoners also expended a fair amount of energy fighting off sexual predators and nursing their wounds. I've spent my career researching and writing about gender and justice, actually injustice. More specifically, my work is focused on black women in incarceration in the post-Civil War South, a topic unfamiliar to many scholars, but highly recognizable to the incarcerated women I've had the privilege to share my work with. They understand what it means to be over-policed, over-incarcerated, underprotected, and exploited by the state. And hearing their stories makes it more and more difficult for me to distinguish between the past and present. It has become more and more evident to me that the past is the present. Today, black women only make up 13% of the general female population, but represent 30% of the female prison population and 44% of the female jail population. 150 years ago, black women made up over 90% of the female prison and jail populations of the post-Civil War South. Mass incarceration has always disproportionately affected African American women, but the overemphasis on the plight of the black male in the U.S. justice system has resulted in the obscuring of black women's experiences of mass imprisonment. Nevertheless, the disproportionate rates of incarceration are only half of the story of black women in mass imprisonment in America. The other half involves the vicious sentencing policies black women have had to endure. Today, we see this reflected in the overpunishment of black women for nonviolent drug-related offenses and self-defense-related crimes. In the past, black women also faced sentencing disparities and were forced to serve long-term prison terms, prison terms for similar offenses. Given these facts, one is left to ponder why black women and girls, for that matter, are nearly invisible in debates about mass incarceration. Why are there seemingly negligible numbers when compared with black men used to justify their erasure? Why aren't black women's cries being heard instead of being drowned out amid the deafening defense of black manhood? And when will we move from apathy to outrage over the killing and locking away of black women by the state? When will incarcerated black women's lives begin to matter? My recently published book, Chained in Silence, Black Women in Convict Labor in the New South, was written as a corrective to the male-focused, uneven rendering of the history of punishment in the United States. In writing this book, I wanted to make working-class incarcerated Black women and girls visible and legible, to document their inner lives and tell their stories. I wanted to move them from the periphery of public and intellectual discourse to the center, emphasizing the prominent role they played in rebuilding the physical and economic infrastructure of the war-torn South, reaching to the outermost margins of history to salvage the voices of the forgotten. This was my way of reclaiming lesser-known, less respectable Black women whose burdens and tribulations had been left unaccounted for. In order to tell these stories, I had to dig deep. I mined 8 archives and hundreds of newspaper articles to reconstruct this history, among other sources. And each record I found revealed something different about the day-to-day realities these women and girls faced. Clemency applications, for example, gave me a glimpse into their medical struggles. I discovered that many inmates were sick and dying at the point of clemency, and that they were only released because they were no longer viable or profitable. Through these records, I also witnessed the desperation on the part of prisoners, family members, and sympathetic petitioners who wrote in on these women's behalf, advocating for their release. One of the most impactful and illuminating examples of the state's handling of a disposable Black female body can be found in the case of Ella Gamble. And Ella Gamble's application for clemency is displayed here. In 1884, Gamble, a 22-year-old pregnant newlywed mother and domestic worker, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Georgia State Penitentiary. She was accused of poisoning her employer. From the point of her incarceration until the date of her release, she passed through 5 prison camps, a broom factory, 2 brickyards, and 2 plantations. Her final destination was the state prison farm, where she spent the last months of her life dying from cancer and begging to be free. These were some of her last words. Judge Turner, kind sir, I write you and humbly beg you to please send me home. I have been down sick in bed 12 months today, Judge. I don't feel like I will be here on earth very long. I don't want to die here in prison, and I beg you to please, Judge, for the sake of my poor father, who is lying in his grave, and my mother and brother and sister who is watching and waiting on you to send me home so I can see their faces. Judge, I am no service to myself and neither the state. Judge, please have mercy on me and grant me one kind favor in sending me home, for I have cancer in my bowels. Some weeks I bleeds very near to death. Judge, please pity me and let me go home. To some extent, Gamble's poor health resulted from the heavy labor she was forced to perform while imprisoned. But much of the damage caused to her organs stemmed from repeated floggings, sexual abuse, and medical neglect, in addition to injurious childbirths. Census records show that by 1900, Gamble had given birth to 6 babies, 4 living and 2 dead. At least one of these children was conceived with her husband between 1880, the year they were married, and 1884, the year she was convicted. The rest of her offspring were the byproduct of rape in the state's camps. Incidences of sexual violence and what I call, quote, menacing reproduction litter the Southern prison archive. But babies' footprints left no impression in the annals of Georgia's penitentiary system. Although pregnancies and births were meticulously registered by prison camp doctors, the status of these offspring was omitted from these otherwise copious records. Children born to incarcerated mothers had no value, and Black women's wombs after slavery had no worth. Whereas the viability of the Southern plantation economy rested on enslaved women's capacity to produce labor and laborers, post-Civil War penal regimes viewed pregnancy and childbirth as deterrents to economic progress. This is best illustrated through the act of killing infants born in prison camps, and this was particularly the case in Georgia, where I found numerous examples of this, and the prioritization of heavy manual labor in Georgia, which was considered the industrial capital of the New South and had more industries than any other state to emerge after emancipation. And so what this did was it required the indiscriminate it placed an indiscriminate demand on the energies of all prisoners, male and female, to produce within this post-bellum industrial penal economy. As I mentioned before, this is best illustrated through the act of killing infants born in prison camps and the prioritization of heavy manual labor, which resulted in the permanent wounding and impairment of imprisoned black women's reproductive bodies. Before and after the Civil War, childbearing and bondage was a consequence of oppression. It stripped enslaved and incarcerated women of their reproductive control. And if you're familiar with work by Dorothy Roberts or Priscilla Ochin, you understand what this means. Whether forced to produce children for the plantation economy or having one's ability to reproduce taken away by the state, captive black women were treated as objects incapable of regulating their reproductive lives. While giving birth during slavery was frequently an expression of one's lack of control over one's reproductive autonomy, after emancipation, the right to reproduce or not was an expression of one's independence. For the first time, black women could claim legal rights over their wombs and control their reproductive lives. In my view, this was a unique way for black women to exercise their right to citizenship, especially since voting wasn't an option for them. Being a mother and a wife was in many instances all the political currency black women had. Biological oppression was used to impede incarcerated black women's ability to express their rights to citizenship through reproduction and motherhood. And I'll also say that this in some ways extended to free black women or women who weren't incarcerated, and I think that this is best expressed through the act of lynching pregnant women. So I've actually been doing some research and thinking more deeply and broadly about menacing reproduction and how biological oppression affected incarcerated women, but also women who weren't incarcerated. And so the lynching of the unborn and the lynching of free black women is now beginning to factor into my work. Family bonds were obliterated by the penal regime. Mother-child attachments were severed, and black children were eliminated through corporal destruction. The carceral regimes of post-war and Jim Crow Georgia especially used menacing reproduction to control and end black lives. The profit-driven penal economy and the distinct demands it imposed on Georgia's female felons to perform male-oriented industrial labor and to match the output of their male peers left no space for maternity. Suckling babies threatened to drain the lessee's earnings by consuming their mother's time and energy. They were considered costly and disposable. To provide some context, the convict lease system was adopted in all of the southern states after the Civil War. How many of you are familiar or a little familiar with convict leasing? Okay. It was a system that primarily affected black prisoners, and those convicted of felony offenses were forcibly leased to private companies and factories by the state for a fee. They worked from sunup to sundown. They were beaten and flogged. The women were raped. Their humanity was denied. They were severely punished. If they escaped, they were separated. They were severely punished if they escaped. They were separated from their families, and many were made to serve life sentences. Sexual and reproductive control is what ensured black women's full participation in the convict leasing system. This system relied on conviction as opposed to conception to supply its bound labor forces. The decline in black women's reproductive and maternal work was tied to their increase in productive value. The control of black women's work was predicated on the control of their wombs. The story of Eliza Randall, a 17-year-old, quote, Negro girl who was convicted of murdering her abusive father, who in her words, forced her into, quote, improper sexual relations with him and threatened to whip her, stands out as an intense illustration of the effects of menacing reproduction on the lives of incarcerated black women and girls in the post-Civil War South. On January 5th, 1892, Randall gave birth at the Camp Piedmont prison plantation, and here's a sketch of Camp Piedmont, which was published in the newspaper in 1892. Her baby was the first of 3 children born in the camp hospital. It was also the first to die. Soon after taking its first breath, Randall's baby was carried to a river and plunged into a liquid grave. On the word of Bud Hilly, a former guard at the camp, quote, "On more than one occasion, a convict would give birth in an all-female prison camp." Okay. No time could be spared for a nursing mother. So on Maddox's standing order, the newborn was simply taken to the river and thrown in. With her heart sagging from the heaviness of her grief, Randall was immediately forced back to work. She was put in charge of running a sawmill and a cotton gin and performing half of the blacksmithing at Camp Herdmont. In my attempt to locate more examples of the vicious treatment of Black mothers and children born in the state's camps, I turned to published essays written by prison reformers and newspaper articles. This is how I was introduced to Kerry Massey, and I want to read a couple of passages from my book that document Massey's journey through Georgia's convict lease system. At the Rising Fawn prison mine, tucked away in the foothills of Dade County, Carrie Massey, a quote 16-year-old Negro girl, built her home in the depths of despair. The young woman's ordeal began in 1882 when she was convicted of murdering William Evans, a well-known owner of a general store in the town of Summerfield near Macon, Georgia. On the night of the killing, Bill Carstarphin, a Black man, heard groans emanating from the shop. He roused the neighborhood and convened a small posse to guard the store. When members of the crowd forced the door open, a quote ghastly sight met their view. Mr. Evans was lying on a bed in the rear of the building. His head was crushed in as if by several blows of an axe, and the bedclothes fearfully saturated with his blood. The small crowd combed every corner of the store looking for Evans's assailant. Kerry Massey was reportedly, quote, hid away beside a pile of shucks. She was pulled out of her hiding place, and her apron and bonnet were found to be spotted with blood. News of the murder spread swiftly throughout the community. A large mob assembled at the scene of the killing, and a proposition was made to lynch Massey. However, the calm voice of a minister of the gospel was heard, and the mob reluctantly abandoned the project. Sheriff Walcott escorted Massey to the county jail, where a reporter was standing by to collect a statement from the 16-year-old girl about the murder. Quote, "What made you kill him?" asked the journalist. Quote, "I didn't kill him. I don't know nothing about it. I ain't killed nobody," replied Massey. She went on to explain, "I went away from Macon last night on the train, and you can ask the conductor if I didn't. I got up there at Summerfield and I was going to see some people that I knowed. It was so dark and cold that I didn't want to be out there in the woods by myself, so I goes to Mr. Evans' store and knocks. Mr. Evans comes to the door and I tells him that I want to come in and stay till morning. When the train came by about 3 o'clock, I saw a man strike a match. I thought he was in the store all the time, and after a while I heard the licks on Mr. Evans, and I heard him say, 'Oh Lord,' then I heard somebody on the outside, and I was so scared I didn't know what to do. When daylight came, I heard the crowd outside say they would kill the first person that came out of the store, and I hid behind the shucks, and that's all I know about it." Massey's declaration of innocence fell on deaf ears. Recognizing the hopeless nature of her circumstances, she challenged authorities to just "do with me what you please, I don't care." And these are her exact words. Notwithstanding the fact that prior to her indictment, she had never been accused, let alone convicted, of committing or conspiring to commit any act of violence, the young woman was forced to exchange her blood-stained dress for a striped one and to toil in Georgia's ruthless convict lease system. So all of this, is happening in 1882. So let's flash forward to 1892. By the time Kerry Massey arrived at the Camp Herdmont prison farm in 1892, she was no longer a young, quote, Negro girl, but a full-grown woman who had given birth to 4 children, and in each instance, the child bore unmistakable signs that the father was white. After 10 years confinement in Georgia's private lease camps, Massey was reduced to, quote, "a plaything of beastly passion." Even while floating in a sea of handsome women at Camp Hurtmont, she still stood out as a preferred target. As reported by reformer Selena Sloan Butler, the bondwoman's captors, quote, became so infatuated with her that peace did not always reign within the camp among the guards. Like so many female captives, Massey's path from adolescence to womanhood was paved in pain. Everywhere her feet touched, between the quarry and the field, the wash house and the stockade, the whipping post and the rapist's clutch, her deathbed and the dissection table, she suffered unceasing insults to her humanity. In February 1895, just 1 month after giving birth to her last child, 26-year-old Kerry Massey and her newborn both died at Camp Hurtmont. An inquest was ordered and the 2 corpses were sent in for autopsy to determine their causes of death. It was concluded that the mother died of puerperal sepsis, also known as childbed fever, a bacterial infection of the female reproductive organs caused by the introduction of contaminated forceps or other unhygienic medical implements into the bondwoman's genital tract during delivery. The infant reportedly died of starvation in the course of its mother's illness. Newspaper articles played an indispensable role in helping me to tell Massey's story. These sources provided the missing details that I needed and couldn't find elsewhere. And this was true for the entire book. To get the full story of the lived and laboring experiences of Southern Black women prisoners, I had to use these problematic sources and read them against other records. The names, dates, locations, details of events, and other specific facts that cannot be determined from the official record were found in abundance in racist editorials. Through the use of conservative white newspapers that hyperbolized and pathologized Black female criminality, I was able to get rare evidence, including statements from female convicts, as in the case of Carrie Massey, that were unavailable elsewhere. So there is some utility to these very problematic records, and so I believe in using what I call the kitchen sink methodology to research. There are ways that you can read a record and use it against itself or against its creator. Whipping reports, an administrative instrument used to inventory the acts of violence and terror meted out against male and female inmates in Georgia's convict lease camps, played an equally important role in helping me to understand the outsized impact violence had on the lives of Black female convicts. Whipping bosses, as they were called, hired by leasees and endorsed by the state, meticulously notated every, quote, stroke and, quote, stripe tendered by the lash, and they cited the name of every, quote, wrongdoer and the content of his or her, quote, misdeeds. But these narratives of cruelty and suffering actually served an important additional function for me. I found that by examining the types of offenses for which bondwomen were punished, as opposed to scrutinizing the processes of punishment alone, one is better able to ascertain the habits of dissent cultivated among female incarcerees. Women prisoners forged a unique culture of dissent in response to the power structure of the Southern penal system and made use of private and public techniques of subversion. Bondwomen malingered, feigned illness, stole, disobeyed orders, set fires, ran away, fought camp guards, cursed their superiors, and destroyed property. While most female convicts used acts of day-to-day resistance in their attempts to thwart the state-sponsored attack on their self-worth, others made more dramatic displays of their discontent. They ran away. Some absconded in hopes of securing freedom from overwork. Others fled physical and or sexual abuse and tyranny. Women like Maddie Crawford, pictured here, used public and private acts of resistance to help sustain themselves in their journey through unfreedom's wild territory. In 1896, Maddie Crawford was convicted of murdering her abusive stepfather and sentenced to a life term in the Georgia State Penitentiary. She was sent to the Chattahoochee Brickyard, where she spent the first 3 years of her sentence. As stated by an unnamed reporter for the Atlanta Constitution newspaper, Quote, after being there a while, her great strength and activity caused those in charge of her to plan heavy work for her. She expressed a desire to become a blacksmith, and she was taught the trade, end quote. The reporter also makes mention of the fact that, quote, with her skirts being in the way, the guards forced her to put on the trousers. Several whippings were necessary to make her consent to this. While I am doubtful that Crawford had much choice in the matter, I believe her decision to comply with learning the blacksmith trade was an act of self-preservation. Unable to physically resist her captor's attempts to defeminize her, Crawford resorted to the use of a different resistance technique. She feigned complicity and took advantage of the perks afforded her. Yet within, I believe she secretly affirmed her womanhood, using her proficiency as an ironsmith as a measurement of her own feminine identity. Imprisoned for a lifetime, Crawford also opted to use her skills to temporarily liberate herself from the physical and symbolic constraints of prison life. Just the same, by embracing masculine garb and practicing male-oriented labor, she contested the imposed heterosexual violence levied against the black female body. While male clothing certainly did not make an African-American woman impervious to sexual assault, it is still quite possible that Crawford used her dress and vocation as a blacksmith to redirect the gaze of her captors and to refashion the way in which her body was framed by her keepers and the system as a whole. In essence, she bent her gender identity in the same way that she bent the iron for the sake of her survival. Now, my personal intellectual investment and commitment to telling the stories of incarcerated black women like Ella Gamble, Eliza Randall, Carrie Massey, and Maddie Crawford was my primary motive for writing Chained in Silence. But there's a more personal reason why I wrote this book. I am the great-granddaughter of Georgia sharecroppers who lived and labored under the same fog of Jim Crow and weathered the same climate of terror as the women I write about. My great-grandfather, Leon Johnson, was born in 1903 in LaGrange, Georgia. My great-grandmother, Leola, pictured here, see her little sweet face, was born in 1904 in a town called Rough Edge, believe it or not too far from LaGrange. I wrote about Grandma Leola in the prologue to Chained in Silence, and I'd like to share those reflections with you now, just to end on somewhat of a happy note, right? There's nothing happy about this stuff, but we're going to try. So the prologue reads like this. This book is an effort to give voice to a group that has been too long silent. There was no greater inspiration for this effort than memories of my great-grandmother, a woman of quiet dissemblances, meaningful pauses, and reticence when it came to sharing too much about the past. Born in 1904 in Troup County, Georgia, to a family of sharecroppers, Grandma Leola had a mental strongbox filled with memories. Though occasionally she would unfetter her recollections and reveal the details of her life, there was much about her youth that never left that sacred container. As a young girl, I spent many Saturday afternoons at my great-grandparents' charming little house on Harvest Lane. I would whiz through the front gate with my mother trailing behind and make my way to the front porch where Grandma, drop the D, we call her Grandma, not Grandma. Anybody from the South understands. Grandma would be sitting on a sun-bleached wooden bench scouting the pretty cars, rowdy chillins, and strangers passing by. Among the neighborhood folks, she was renowned for her ability to wield an axe like a samurai, wring a chicken's neck with half a twist, turn fried meat in her bare hands, and flip blazing hot cornbread into her leathery palms without scalding her flesh, and this is true. And you did not want to be spanked with those palms. Even though she was super sweet, I never got a spanking. Those palms were lethal. They should have been registered. Our greeting was always the same. Hi, Grandma. Hi, baby. Next, she would bend down to hug me. Her skin looked and felt like chocolate pudding, and her powder-scented dresses gave off a faint scratching sound whenever she moved. Then I would tiptoe past her snuff can. Yes, my grandmother, as demure as she was, dipped snuff, and her spit bucket and take a seat on the bench. Now and then, Grandma would reach into her heart and offer me a tiny morsel of her life history. I enjoyed watching the light come into Grandma's eyes as she proudly spoke about birthing all 13 of them chillins, or of the days of my great-grandfather, the days he spent, quote, making a fool out of himself, trying to woo her. She would say, your grandpa was a pretty man and all them gals wanted him but me. Then an earthquake of laughter would shake her entire body. But when I would ask what it was like coming of age in Rough Edge, a rural farming town on the outer edge of LaGrange, Georgia, all that joy would vanish. A vulnerability would enter her eyes. She would run her wide fingertips against her wrinkled forehead, and in a low, serious tone, she would say things like, child and white folks was something else back in my day. Couldn't cross them tracks after dark. Mama, Jessie Lee, Sally, Fanny, and Willie, which were her older siblings, worked hard in the fields because my daddy gone dead. Her dad died when she was 5 years old. Me and Horace got us some schooling though. I got real good with my reading and writing. Then I had to start helping out. We was real poor, but when we got grown, we got us some families and we ain't never getting no trouble. No, sir. So you were a sir if you were a woman or a man or a girl or a boy. On this subject, Grandma Leola was never quite clear. Her sentences broke off and ran together, forcing me to read between obscure lines to understand her. When she died at age 95, she left me with more questions than answers. What unnamed indignities had she endured at the hands of Southern white folkses? Why does she so esteem her reproductive power and find it essential to publicly reinscribe her femininity by conceiving and birthing many children? Why, despite the racial and gendered barriers strewn in her path, did she dare to hope literacy would improve her ability to maneuver the rough terrain of poverty and exclusion? Why did she endorse a strict code of respectability almost exclusively steeped in obedience to law and order? And why did the specter of white racial hostility, violence, terror, and legal subjugation bewilder her recollections, causing her to conceal certain segments of the past? In writing this book, I have studied my great-grandmother's pain and come face to face with more than a handful of excruciating truths. I found that Troup County, Georgia, the place Grandma Leola called home, was the headquarters for the worst chain gang in the state of Georgia. It was a place where, quote, fearless, hardened men from other camps who had escaped or were recaptured, and those who were without friends or political aid, were brutalized for not keeping the lick. Among these men was Robert Burns, a white northern miscreant whose public expose, I am a fugitive from a Georgia chain gang, revealed one part of the human tragedy taking place in Grandma Leola's backyard, but not all of it. The other side of that calamity forms the subject of this book. In 1932, the year Burns' memoir was published, 5 black women were sentenced to hard labor on the Troup County chain gang. Nearly 200 others were forced to toil in labor camps scattered throughout the state of Georgia. For nearly a century, the specter of mass imprisonment haunted black Georgians, women included. Respectable ladies like Grandma Leola, as well as the more rebellious echelon of Freedom's daughters, were all burdened by Southern injustice. They coexisted in a milieu where the threat of incarceration was omnipresent. Thus, Chained in Silence is as much an attempt to excavate the memories Grandma Leola dared to forget as it is an opportunity to give voice to the women still waiting to be heard. I'm very grateful that the voices of these women are finally being heard, but there are so many that are not. They are calling out to be remembered and properly memorialized. Some women, like the woman buried in Sugar Land, are literally emerging from the ground to be noticed. Her presence is a reminder that we are actually walking and resting on restless souls. Like lynch victims and the enslaved, victims of the convict lease system deserve to be remembered. It's time to acknowledge America's shame rather than bury it. We do this for Confederate generals and soldiers. Why not do this for the tens of thousands of incarcerated men, women, and youth who actually helped build this nation? Thank you. We are on time, but at this time, I'm glad to answer or invite any questions that you may have.
Yeah, so we're at 1:08 and the next session starts at 1:35. So you're a good 20 minutes. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yes.
Any questions? And if you don't ask your questions now, I'll be available to answer questions after the session. So, yeah.
I have read parts of the book, The New Jim Crow, about the war on drugs, and I was wondering if you could apply some of your expertise to that era. This is a small part because I wasn't able to see any of the black women prominence displayed in that.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. So for those of you who didn't hear her question, she wanted me to apply my expertise to The New Jim Crow. If you've read Michelle Alexander's masterwork, The New Jim Crow, it truly is a compelling and important work. And it helps to highlight, the epidemic of mass incarceration, in particular its impact on black men, but it does not foreground the experiences of women. So just to, I guess, contextualize that work, during the same time that mass incarceration was on the rise and that, the drug war was helping to fuel, the system, because as we understand and as the work highlights, mass incarceration was in many ways, contemporary mass incarceration, because I don't believe that mass incarceration started in the 60s or 70s or in the 80s with the drug wars. I believe that it started in the post-emancipation South, the moment that black people started being locked up in droves and as a way to, to strip them of their freedom. And so during this period, the rate of incarceration of black women rose by 883%. Okay, so black women were disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, and I'm currently working on a book that it's more focused on, the contemporary crisis in black female mass incarceration. And I have to tell you that every single woman that I have interviewed was convicted based on a drug charge, and every single one of them was criminalized on the basis of their poverty and addiction. None of them were given the option of even being seen through the lens of an addict. They weren't offered drug court, and they sure as heck weren't offered, rehabilitation. So in the same way that black men don't have access to rehabilitation, to social services, and all of the things that, Michelle Alexander mentions in her work, it's just as bad for black women, but in many cases worse, because these women, oftentimes, when they get out of prison, they have absolutely nowhere to go. Sometimes men may have a girlfriend or a partner or somebody waiting on them to, to take care of them. But these women, sometimes they're able to rely on their families, other times they're not. So their children, are oftentimes placed in foster care. And oftentimes you're not even released unless you have somewhere to go. And so there are some issues, particularly around like motherhood and reproduction, that incarcerated women experience that are very unique to their experience. A man can't give birth in a prison cell on a floor, right, with no medical attention. And this happens all the time, and it doesn't just happen to black women. And so they're giving birth sometimes to stillborn babies. They haven't been, given proper medical care, food, attention, or they're shackled to hospital beds. So I don't know if that helps to nuance a little bit how this epidemic affects black women today, but we definitely need to incorporate a more gendered discussion, because this macro narrative is getting played out, in my opinion. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
What about the use of marijuana? How it's being more legalized, but also I feel like I see more good black women getting labor for marijuana.
I'm sorry. I need you to use your outside voice.
I'm sorry. So I feel like I see more black women getting charged for marijuana and having marijuana and getting fines and things for that, even though it's something that more people are using, and it's something, especially the black community, has been more incarcerated for.
Yeah, well, I haven't been paying as much attention to the marijuana, possession charges, and if it is in fact having a disproportionate effect on, Black female incarceration, I would love to know more about that. I think some of it is, based on where you live, and I know that like most of the Black women that I know, they've been incarcerated primarily for cocaine or crack. So for, using or being in possession of cocaine or crack to use, not distribute. So I'm not as aware of how marijuana is factoring into this. But I would imagine that it is, I'm paying close attention to the opium epidemic, and it's really interesting to me how the nation is responding to that as opposed to how it responded, to Black people being strung out on crack. And how crack was sort of portrayed as a drug that only affected Black people. There were plenty of white people smoking crack in the 80s. I knew some. So, I use really good skin cream, but, I grew up, I remember when the crack epidemic hit. It hit some of my family members. I mean, there were people that my mother wouldn't even allow to visit unless she put her purse in the trunk. I mean, it destabilized, it really, did a number on poor people and working class people, and not just Black people. I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but.
I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about the lynching of pregnant Black women.
Yeah.
After the Civil War.
Yeah, when I was writing this book, and I write a lot about lynching in the first chapter. And, just to really think broadly about racial violence and how gendered racial violence and how it impacted Black women overall, not just in prison camps, but in general. And I remember coming across the case of a woman named Mary Turner. I don't know if you've ever heard about Mary Turner. She was lynched when I think she was about 8 months pregnant. Her husband was lynched first. And then she was lynched after her husband. And they lynched her, cut her stomach open, extracted the fetus, crushed it with a boot, riddled her body with bullets, burned it, and then burned her body. So she was lynched like 4 times, and her unborn child was lynched. And so it made me curious to start looking into other, cases. And so I started looking at all, NAACP records, and I'm currently authoring a piece called, Menacing Reproduction. And I just started seeing all these examples of these women who were lynched while they were pregnant. And I remember seeing a case of 2 sisters, both of whom were in advanced stages of pregnancy, being lynched together. And so, I'm really trying to work through that, but I do believe that in some ways these women were either lynched as a consequence of their men trying to exercise, their rights to vote. So in some cases these women were lynched, as a consequence of that. But I also believe that they were lynched as a way to prevent them from exercising their full rights to citizenship by creating new citizens. And so there's a lot going on there that I'm really trying to work through. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for telling the stories of the women who, were raped. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of archives in telling and unearthing these stories, and how, and personal narratives as well, like yours.
Yeah, so, I know that for those of you who study the archive and the power of the archive and how powerful the archive is, and, who do more archival theory, I want you to feel encouraged that, again, as I mentioned, you can use records in myriad ways, right, that don't necessarily affirm, the creator or the violent intention of those records, if that makes sense. So for me, I really had to allow myself to use records that have, been obviously viewed as problematic, as in some ways untrustworthy. But there are so many ways that you can extract, worth and truth out of these records. You just have to use lots of different kinds of records and then lay them all up against one another. And what you'll find is that oftentimes you'll see like lots of redundancy in different records and records can be located in different states all over the country. I think there were times when I found records in Texas that were like the missing piece. Like I found a document that I never knew existed, and I found it like 4 years into writing the book in a folder in a manuscript collection in Texas. So I don't know if this like answers your question, but I'm just saying that the archive does play an important role in the telling of these stories. But I also believe in the use of the archive of your imagination and using informed speculation as a way, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the locus of impossible speech, to reach, to be able to tell these stories and to go a little bit deeper, than what the archive suggests. And so I do believe that that is extremely important. And I feel like for anyone who wants to write these kinds of histories, you've got to do both.
So I'm sure a lot of people in this room, we 100% believe that you are giving voices to what were forcibly silenced or hidden. How often do you get met with criticism that you're just rewriting history or trying to cause problems?
Well, what I will say is that Chained in Silence is the first book ever published on the topic. So, I've had home court advantage. And so until more books of the subject are published, there may be more, critique. To be honest, I have to say that I usually don't get much pushback. I have had a couple of convict lease scholars, white male convict lease scholars, come for me in book reviews and suggested that I don't care, you've written this 300-page or however many books, but these women still contributed nothing to the postbellum penal economy. They were cooks, and they washed clothes, and they worked at domestic capacity at the end. And these were people who never even committed 1 page, or 2 pages to just saying, hey, the women might have been here, I don't know, but I'm gonna just say something just to keep myself out of trouble. No, they didn't even care. And one scholar wrote an entire book on convict leasing and chain gangs in Georgia and did not mention women at one time. So, and I've had scholars, white male scholars, tell me that that I had one tell me confidentially that he was embarrassed for not incorporating women's stories. Like I said, they're everywhere and nowhere. They're all over the archive. You just have to have a commitment to search for them and to stitch their stories together. But their stories have to matter, and they don't. To many, scholars who have just kind of bypassed them. Female scholars too. I mean, it doesn't. We just talked about the New Jim Crow. I mean, it's not just a white male thing. There are plenty of black scholars who don't incorporate gender into their analysis of the carceral state.
Have you seen other instances in your work about masculinization of black women, not just the labor that is listed?
Oh, you said, have I seen other
instances of masculinizing black women
through the prison system?
Or throughout others.
In writing this book, this was the first time that I noticed how much white Southerners went out of their way to emasculate black women. And it was the first time that I realized that black women's dress, like how political dress was, and that black women's dress was a socio-political marker of their transition from slavery to freedom. So the ability to be able to wear, what you want, and black women went, to great means to find nice dresses, and they wanted to be recognized as full, real, they wanted to be seen as true women, but that category was only reserved, for white women in the postbellum context. So when they enter into the prison, they make them wear men's garb, brogans, and in some instances, as in the sketch of Camp Hermont, if you notice all the women's hair, all the women, their hair is low cropped. I think they shaved their heads and put them in dresses, and that was their way of reform. So when they take them out of men's clothes, they shave their heads and put them in dresses. So they went out of their way to do that. So flash forward, when I think about Sandra Bland, and I think about other women, I think about that young girl who was beat up by that police resource officer in that South Carolina classroom when he mowed her down like he was on a football field. And I think about all of the other instances in which black women's bodies are not treated as fragile, or even as women. I think that broadly applies, in a carceral context and just in our day-to-day experiences.
I just wanted to know if you see any connections with your topic of medicine, reproductive oppression to what we're seeing now with maternal mortality rates and them rising in the black community, especially in America and in places like Texas where they've defunded Planned Parenthood. Just any connection.
You're right on my block. I'm actually working through that for one of the chapters in my new book, Doc in a Box. So, the image is a doctor's hand, in the box, reaching, but not actually providing care, close care. Whatever, I'll get it. So, no, I really am trying to unpack that and tease that out, and I haven't gotten there yet. So, if you're knowledgeable about that and you have some sources to share, let me tell you something. Professors are perpetual learners. We do not know everything, and you all teach us so much. So, if there's anybody working on anything in that regard or anything that might be beneficial to me, and if there are things that I can share with you, by all means, I'm willing to do that. But the fact that you asked that question means that I'm on the right page. I just need to find the sources to write the pages, right?
I wanted to know what your thoughts are on the value of enslaved women and their ability to do production and reproduction, like how holes were dug out so that they could feed them and protect the fetus, versus, post-carceral, post in the antebellum era and post-expella era, that women, they were no longer valued, and so their bodies weren't valued, and
their productive labor and their working bodies.
Exactly, but the reproductive labor wasn't, and how as soon as they became unproductive or unproductive, or lost their value, that they were released because they were no longer needed to be.
If they were dying.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the perfect reason to get rid of them, and that's really what it was. It wasn't that it was clemency.
Yep.
It was disposal. And so just kind of the juxtaposing of the value of women's bodies.
Yeah, I mean I did a lot of reading about enslaved women and their experiences, and then I did a lot of reading about, women in these convict lease camps. In some ways, their worlds and their experiences were very parallel. But when it came to this reproduction thing, it's the minute that black women's wombs lose their worth, they don't, the only reason that black women's reproductive, the only reason that their reproductive health was attended to in some cases was to improve their ability to produce labor. So if you've got horrible, if you have, a lot of these women have prolapsed uteruses, so I saw numerous cases of women with prolapsed uteruses. Why are their uteruses prolapsing? In some cases from extremely heavy labor. And so if you're pushing, if the pressure is pushing down, it's going to cause the uterus to fall out of its carriage, and that did happen a lot. And a lot of these women were giving birth, so the traumatic childbirth. And if you add sexual assault on top of that, so the only times that they were actually, the prison physicians were attending to their reproductive health was to stitch them up so that they could do more labor. But to have babies in prison camps, first of all, they weren't supposed to be there. Right? slavery was all about reproducing through either the domestic slave trade or through, natural reproduction with the closing of the, suppression of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. It was expected. And even throughout, its entire existence, enslaved women were not rapeable. They were property, right? Well, after slavery, in prison camps, sometimes all-female prison camps, women are not supposed to be giving birth. So they didn't want those babies there. And those babies were disposable. They didn't generate well. And, that was a huge distinction, but a very important one, because the assumption would be that these patterns would continue. And in some states, I have to say, in Alabama, as cruel as it was, there were other states. Now, Georgia, this is where I saw all this infant death, and because it was the New South, capital, it was the center of industry in the region. So these women had to work like men at the same jobs as men. But in places like Alabama, and where, it was still, women were doing mostly farm work, in those, spaces, they actually allowed women to take care of their children and to raise their young. And so I actually have a picture, I should have brought it with me, of a bunch of incarcerated women standing in front of the barracks of the Wetumpka Women's Prison. And one woman, she's holding the baby on her lap. And these babies oftentimes were babies that they had with other prisoners. So the way that community was shaped in that context was very different than Georgia.
It seems like a lot of these women were falsely accused, so could you speak more to the barriers they faced in trying to get a free trial but maybe not getting one, a fair trial?
Yeah, well, in this context, first of all, for the women who were accused, women who like Ella Gamble, women like Carrie Massey, when a woman was accused of, killing a white man, it didn't matter if you had a trial. Usually the trial was about 5 minutes and that was it. And so as you can imagine, the same way that people today, have problems with getting legal counsel, they couldn't afford to pay, attorneys. And so typically, I think, there was a grand jury that was usually impaneled, and they would make quick decisions. And usually those decisions were not in the woman's favor. I'm hard pressed to think of one case where a woman was actually found not guilty. Even when they killed other or assaulted other black people, black men in particular. A lot of these women were domestic abuse survivors, and they killed their spouses. So some of them were also sent to the convict release camps, because that's where all the felons went. And then the misdemeanor prisoners went to the chain gangs for a shorter period of time. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I'd like to know, before you finish your book or after you finish your book, did you hear from descendants of the extended family? Any of these women?
I didn't, but that darn William Maddox that I talked about, who ran Camp Hermon and would have the babies drowned in the river and all that, it was his great-great-grandson who told me those stories. He's writing a book on him. And so he went into his archive and was very generous with me. And he wrote a piece, he's writing a book on him, and he wrote a piece for Georgia Backroads, and I think it was called The Meanest Man in Georgia, about William Maddox. And so it was actually his descendant that told me about what happened and how Maddox would tell them to drown the babies in the river. So he's the only descendant I've interacted with.
Interesting. Good to speak now.
Yeah, right?
It is 1:30.
Oh, it is? Okay. So if you want to hang around for the round table or want to grab a book, I'm glad to sign it. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you.
I was I'm gonna text you whatever, and I'll come by that was not bad. It's good. That's like before I left the
Table discussion, so you can be more personal with her.
Okay, fabulous.
Community, so yeah, it's like networking.
And so I complete a lot of shit. I have to update my business card. But
Yeah, and if you, like I